My name is Rebecca Hayes, and I was 43 the year my stepfather died and left me the house on Clermont Street. Not the contents, not the bank accounts, not the retirement funds or the car or the modest investment portfolio he had managed for 30 years with the quiet discipline of a man who believed compound interest was the only reliable relationship in life. Just the house. My mother, Diane, inherited everything else. Approximately $890,000 in combined assets, documentation. Frank Morrison, the estate attorney, laid out on his conference table 3 days after the funeral with the measured calm of a man who had delivered this kind of information before and knew which details would land hard. The house was appraised at $1.4 million. My mother filed a lawsuit the next morning. I should tell you about Thomas Hayes because he is not replaceable in this story, and because what he did cannot be understood without understanding who he was. Thomas married my mother when I was 6 years old. My biological father had left 2 years earlier, not dramatically, just a steady withdrawal until one day he wasn't living with us anymore and my mother stopped mentioning him. Thomas appeared at a PTA meeting. He was a high school math teacher, 41, recently divorced, no children of his own. He and my mother dated for 8 months. They married in a quiet ceremony at a courthouse in Boulder. He moved into our apartment in Capitol Hill, and 6 months later we moved into the house on Clermont Street, a 1950s brick ranch Thomas had saved for and purchased outright because he did not believe in mortgages. He raised me, not helped raise. Raised my mother, worked in pharmaceutical sales, and traveled 3 weeks out of every month. Thomas was the one who made school lunches and helped with homework and sat through parent-teacher conferences and drove me to soccer practice in a station wagon he kept running until I graduated high school. He was steady in the way certain people are steady, not because it comes naturally, but because they have decided it is the correct way to be and have organized their entire lives around the decision. He taught me how to read a map, how to balance a checkbook, how to change a tire, how to apologize when I was wrong and stand firm when I wasn't. He never called me his daughter. He called me Rebecca, always with the respect you give someone whose autonomy you intend to protect. My mother called me Becca when she remembered to call at all. Thomas retired from teaching at 65. He spent his retirement reading history books and maintaining the house and walking to the library every Tuesday and Thursday because he said a man without a routine was a man rehearsing for death. He died of a heart attack on a Sunday morning in his backyard garden, pruning shears in his hand. Tomatoes ripening on the vine, I found him. I had come by to help him install a new sprinkler system. I pulled into the driveway at 9:15 and walked around the side of the house because he didn't answer the front door and saw him on the ground beside the raised beds. I called 911. I held his hand. I sat in the grass beside him while the paramedics confirmed what I already knew, and I did not cry because Thomas had taught me that grief required privacy, and I was sitting in a yard with 6 strangers. I cried later. I cried for 2 days. My mother arrived from a conference in Phoenix on the 3rd day. She stood in the kitchen Thomas had renovated in 2003 and looked at me with the expression of a woman calculating something I couldn't see yet. Frank Morrison called us both to his office the following week. He read the will in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building downtown with a view of the mountains Thomas had loved and photographed and never once felt the need to climb. Clear, specific, notarized 3 years earlier. To my wife, Diane Hayes, I leave all financial accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds, and personal property, excluding real property. To Rebecca Hayes, I leave the house and property located at 4782 Clermont Street, Denver, Colorado, held in my sole name, free and clear. My mother's face did not change while Frank read it. Mine did not change either. But I felt something shift underneath the grief. Something I couldn't name yet but would recognize later as the first movement of a fault line that had been forming for 25 years. Frank finished reading. He set the will on the table between us. My mother picked up her purse. She said, "I'll be in touch, Rebecca." She walked out. I sat in the conference room with Frank Morrison and the view of the mountains and the will on the table, and I said the only thing I could think to say, "What happens now?" Frank looked at me over his reading glasses. Now, he said, "We wait to see if she contests it." She filed the next morning a petition to invalidate the bequest of the Clermont Street property on grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The lawsuit claimed I had manipulated Thomas into disinheriting my mother of the family home. I read the filing in my apartment in Capitol Hill, the same apartment I had lived in for 11 years, the same neighborhood I had grown up in before we moved to Clermont Street. I read it twice. Then I called Frank Morrison. Part 2 is where Frank tells me what undue influence actually means and where I find the letter Thomas left in the desk drawer. Drop a comment and subscribe. Frank Morrison's office was on the 9th floor of the same building where he had read Thomas's will 6 days earlier. I sat across from him at 8:00 on a Tuesday morning with a copy of my mother's lawsuit in a folder on my lap and a cup of coffee I hadn't touched going cold on the desk between us. Frank had his reading glasses on. He had the lawsuit open in front of him. 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to one claim repeated in 4 different ways. Rebecca Hayes exerted undue influence over Thomas Hayes during the final years of his life, resulting in the improper transfer of the primary marital asset to a non-spouse beneficiary. I asked Frank what undue influence actually meant. He took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "It means your mother is claiming you manipulated Thomas into leaving you the house," he said. That you took advantage of a relationship of trust or dependency to benefit yourself at her expense. It's a specific legal standard. To succeed, she has to prove 4 elements. He counted them on his fingers. 1, that Thomas was susceptible to influence due to age, illness, or mental weakness. 2, that you had the opportunity to exert that influence. 3, that you had a disposition to exert it, meaning a motive. And 4, that the result, the bequest of the house to you, was unnatural or improper given the family circumstances. I looked at the lawsuit. Thomas was 71, I said. He had no diagnosed cognitive impairment. He was mentally sharp until the day he died. I have his medical records. Frank nodded. That weakens element 1. I lived in Capitol Hill, I said. I visited twice a week. I didn't live with him. I didn't manage his finances. I didn't have power of attorney. That weakens element 2 in the house, I said. Thomas bought it before he married my mother. It was titled in his name alone. The deed shows that. Frank leaned back in his chair. That's the strongest defense, he said. In Colorado, property held in one spouse's sole name prior to marriage remains separate property, unless it's actively transmuted into marital property through refinancing, retitling, or commingling. He paused. Did Thomas ever add your mother's name to the deed? No. Did they refinance the house during the marriage? No. Thomas paid cash in 1993. There was never a mortgage. Frank wrote something in his legal pad. Then the house was his separate property, he said. He had the legal right to leave it to anyone he chose. Your mother inherited the marital assets, approximately $890,000. You inherited his separate property. That's not undue influence. That's estate planning. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. What do I need to do? I said. Frank pulled a blank legal pad from his drawer and slid it across the desk. Document everything, he said. Every visit you made to the house, every conversation you had with Thomas about his estate, every witness who can testify to his mental capacity in the 3 years before he died. I'll need medical records, the deed history. Any written communication between you and Thomas that shows the nature of your relationship. He paused, and if he left anything in writing, a letter, an explanation, anything that clarifies his intent, I need to see it immediately. I thought about the house on Clermont Street. I thought about the desk in Thomas's study, the oak roll top he had inherited from his own father, the desk where he paid bills and graded papers and kept the kind of organized records that made tax season a 4-hour process instead of a 4-day ordeal. I need to go to the house, I said. Frank nodded. Do it today, and Rebecca, he said. Don't take anything that isn't clearly intended for you. Document what you find, photograph it in place before you move it. I stood up. One more thing, Frank said. Your mother's attorney is a man named Victor Gaines. He's aggressive. He's good. He's going to try to settle this before it goes to hearing because the facts don't favor her position. He'll offer you a cash buyout for the house. A number that sounds significant but is less than the appraised value. How much less? I said. Frank looked at the lawsuit. Probably half, he said. Maybe $700,000. I picked up my coat. I'm not selling the house, I said. Good, Frank said. Then let's build the file. I went to Clermont Street that afternoon. The house was exactly as I had left it the morning I found Thomas in the garden. The sprinkler system materials were still in the driveway where I had dropped them when I ran to the backyard. Nobody had moved them. I used the key Thomas had given me 17 years ago when I got my driver's license. He had handed it to me on a keyring with a small brass tag engraved with my initials and said, "You're always welcome here, Rebecca. You don't need to knock." I let myself in through the front door. The house smelled like Thomas. Old Spice and coffee and the faint wood polish he used on the oak trim every spring. The quiet hit me harder than the smell. The specific silence of a house that has lost the person who made it a home. I walked to the study. The roll-top desk was closed. I lifted it. Inside, organized with the precision I expected, were Thomas's files. Bills paid and filed by month. Tax returns going back 7 years. Medical records in a manila envelope labeled Health T. Hayes, and in the back right cubby, a white envelope with my name on it in Thomas's deliberate print. Rebecca, not Becca, Rebecca. I sat in his desk chair and opened it. Part 3 is where I read what Thomas wrote, and where I understand why he left me the house. Drop a comment and subscribe. The letter was dated 3 years earlier, the same date as the will. Thomas wrote the way he taught, clearly without unnecessary words, covering what needed to be covered in the order that made the most sense. Rebecca, if you are reading this, I am gone and you are sitting at the desk where I have sat for 30 years. I hope the house is yours now. If it is not, if something has prevented that outcome, then I have failed at the one thing I spent the last 3 years making certain would not fail. I need to explain why I am leaving you this house instead of your mother. Your mother and I married when you were 6 years old. I loved her then. I have tried to love her for 25 years, but Diane has never loved this house. She has tolerated it. She has lived in it the way someone lives in a hotel they are waiting to check out of. She wanted to sell it 7 times. Twice in the first 5 years, 3 times when you were in high school, twice more after you moved out. Each time I told her no. This house is not an investment to liquidate. It is the place I raised you. It is the place I intend to die. Those were my words. She stopped asking after the last time, but she did not stop calculating, Rebecca. You are the only person who has ever treated this house the way it deserves to be treated. You painted the porch with me when you were 12. You helped me roof the garage when you were 17. You planted the tomatoes that are still growing in the backyard. You came here not because you had to, but because you wanted to. Your mother came here because I was here. I do not write this with bitterness. I write it with clarity. After I am gone, your mother will inherit the financial assets we built together. That is appropriate. But this house is mine. It was mine before we married, and I am leaving it to the person who loved it the way I loved it. You may be challenged on this. Your mother may contest the will. If she does, you need to know something I have never told you. In 2015, your mother asked me to add her name to the deed. She said it was for estate planning purposes. I consulted an attorney. The attorney told me that once her name was added, the house would become marital property and I would lose the ability to leave it solely to you. I declined to add her name. Your mother was angry for 3 months, then she stopped mentioning it. I kept the deed in my name for one reason. You. Do not let her take this house, Rebecca. It is yours, not because I owed it to you, but because you earned it by showing up. Thomas, I read the letter twice. Then I photographed it on the desk exactly where I had found it. I photographed the envelope. I photographed the cubby it had been stored in. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. I walked to the kitchen and called Frank Morrison. He answered on the second ring. I found the letter, I said. Read it to me. I read it word for word, standing in the kitchen where Thomas had made me breakfast before school for 12 years. When I finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Rebecca, we just won the case. Part 4 is where Victor Gaines makes his settlement offer, and where I sit across from my mother for the first time since the lawsuit. Drop a comment and subscribe. Victor Gaines called 6 days after I found the letter. Not Frank, me directly. Which told me he had done exactly what Frank predicted he would do. He had reviewed the case, realized the legal position was weak, and decided to bypass my attorney and approach me as a grieving stepdaughter who might be persuaded by the right tone and the right number. His voice had the controlled warmth of someone who had practiced empathy without feeling it. Ms. Hayes, I represent your mother in the estate matter. I'm calling because I believe we can resolve this without the expense and emotional difficulty of protracted litigation. I said nothing, he continued. Your mother wants you to know she's not contesting your relationship with Thomas. She understands you were close. But the house represents the majority of the estate value, and Colorado law presumes a spouse's primary residence is marital property regardless of title unless there's clear and convincing evidence to the contrary. A judge could rule that the house should have been divided equitably. That was a lie. Frank had already explained that sole title property purchased before marriage stayed separate unless actively transmuted. Victor Gaines knew that. He was betting I didn't. We'd like to offer a settlement, he said. Your mother is willing to pay you $725,000 for your interest in the property. That's more than half the appraised value. You'd receive the funds within 30 days. No trial. No public record, no further conflict. I looked out the window of my apartment at the street below. A bus passed. 2 people waited at the crosswalk. I'll discuss it with my attorney, I said. Ms. Hayes, Victor said, and the warmth dropped half a degree. This is a generous offer. If we proceed to litigation, the court costs alone could consume a significant portion of the estate. Your mother is trying to be fair. I hung up. I called Frank. He listened. Then he said they're scared. That number tells me they know the letter exists and they know what it says. Victor's trying to buy you out before we file our response. What do? I said. We file the response, Frank said. And we include Thomas's letter as an exhibit. My mother called 2 days later, not Victor, her. I almost didn't answer. Then I thought about Thomas sitting at his desk writing a letter he knew I'd eventually read, and I picked up. Becca, she said, we need to talk. I said nothing. Can we meet, she said, just the 2 of us, no lawyers. I told her I'd meet her at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, neutral ground. Public, she arrived 15 minutes late, which was standard. She ordered tea she didn't drink and sat across from me in a window booth with her coat still on. She looked tired, not grief-tired, the tired of someone who has been managing an outcome that keeps slipping away from her. This lawsuit wasn't my idea, she said. I waited. Victor said I had grounds, she said. He said the house should have been split. He said Thomas didn't understand what he was doing when he made the will. Thomas understood exactly what he was doing, I said. Her jaw tightened. You don't know what it was like, Becca. Being married to a man who kept everything separate. His house, his money, his decisions. I lived there for 25 years and he never added my name to anything. Because you asked him to add your name so you could control it, I said. He told me. He wrote it in a letter. Her face went still. I pulled a copy of the letter from my bag, not the original, a photocopy. I set it on the table between us. She looked at it but didn't touch it. He wrote this 3 years ago, I said, the same day he made the will. He knew you'd contest it. He explained why he left me the house instead of you. I slid it toward her. Read it. She didn't pick it up. She stared at it the way people stare at documents they know will say something they don't want confirmed. Thomas raised me, I said. You were on the road 3 weeks a month. He made my lunches. He went to my soccer games. He taught me how to balance a checkbook and change a tire and show up when it mattered. You showed up when it was convenient. That's not fair. She said. It's documented, I said. It's in the letter, and it's going to be in the court file when Frank submits our response. She picked up her tea. Set it down without drinking. What do you want, she said. I want you to drop the lawsuit, I said. You inherited $890,000. The house was never yours. Thomas made that clear in writing. She looked out the window. 2 people passed on the sidewalk, laughing about something I couldn't hear. I loved him, she said quietly. I know, Icy said, but you didn't love the house, and he knew the difference. She stood. She left the letter on the table. She walked out without saying goodbye. Part 5 is where the lawsuit ends, where I tell you what I did with the house and what my mother said the last time we spoke. Drop a comment and subscribe. The lawsuit was dismissed 3 weeks later, not settled, dismissed. Victor Gaines filed a notice of voluntary dismissal without prejudice, which meant my mother could theoretically refile, but Frank said she wouldn't. The letter had made the case unwinnable, and Victor wasn't interested in billing hours on a losing position. Frank called me at 4:00 on a Friday afternoon to tell me it was over. "The house is yours," he said. "Free and clear, no encumbrances, no claims, no further action required." I sat in my apartment, with the phone against my ear, and looked at the framed photograph on my bookshelf. Me and Thomas in the backyard on Clermont Street, both of us holding shovels, dirt on our hands, the raised garden beds half-built behind us. My mother had taken the photo. I was 12. "Thank you, Frank," I said. "He told me Thomas would have been proud." I told him Thomas had planned for exactly this outcome, and we just executed his instructions correctly. Frank laughed. That sounds like something he'd say it was. I moved into the house on Clermont Street 2 months later. Not immediately. I needed time to sit with the grief before I sat with the inheritance. I needed to walk through the rooms and remember Thomas in them before I made them mine. I kept most of his furniture. The oak roll-top desk stayed in the study. The dining table he had refinished in 2008 stayed in the kitchen. The bookshelf in the living room, the one he built himself from reclaimed wood, stayed exactly where he'd placed it. I cleared out his clothes. I donated them to a veterans organization he had supported for 20 years. I kept his wedding ring and his watch and the reading glasses he left on the nightstand. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. The same variety he'd grown. They came up strong. My mother called once after the dismissal. It was brief. She asked if I was living in the house. I said yes. She asked if I was going to sell it. I said no. There was a long pause. Then she said, "He loved you more than he loved me." She said it without bitterness. Just fact. "He loved you differently," I said, "but he raised me and he left me the thing that mattered most to him." She was quiet. Then she said, "Take care of it, Becca." She hung up. I haven't spoken to her since. That was 14 months ago. I refinished the porch last spring. The same porch I painted with Thomas when I was 12. I used the same color, the same careful strokes. I worked slowly because Thomas taught me that work worth doing was worth doing without rushing. The house is appraised now at $1.6 million. The Denver market has been strong. I'm not selling, not because of the value, because of what Thomas wrote in the letter. "This house is the place I raised you. He raised me here, he left it to me, and I'm staying. Not out of obligation. Out of the same reason I showed up twice a week when he was alive, because it mattered. That's my story. One letter, one lawsuit, and a house that belonged to the person who loved it correctly. If someone ever left you something that mattered more than money, you already know why you keep it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.